I think we are ready to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our uh, early morning, relatively speaking, panel here at Balticon. This is Character Development Before the Curtain Goes Up. I'm Christiana Ellis, and I'm the moderator this morning. I am an author, but I also run an actual play live stream slash podcast called So Many Levels. And our panelists this morning, I'll ask each of you to just briefly introduce yourself and you know uh, your thing. So let's start with Anne.
So, hello, I'm Ann Nydam. I am an artist and writer. I write mostly fantasy for a range of ages, kids through adults. And most of my stuff is pretty character driven.
Jay.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Jay Smith. I am a podcaster, writer, and audio playwright. I produced the zombie serial HG World and the pulp series Hidden Harbor Mysteries. Most of writing in audio is done through dialogue, and it's probably some of the most fun I have writing.
And next, Elle Marie Wood.
Hi, I'm Elle Marie Wood. I'm a psychological horror author. I'm also a screenplay writer, and I've tried my hand at stage plays once. That was pretty cool. I agree with Jay. Dialogue is the name of the game when you're dealing with audio, also when you're dealing with the stage, and quite a bit when you're dealing with screenplay. You've got to be able to show and have it vocalized, verbalized, so that you can actually understand what's going on. You can't do all of that introspective work that we can do in novels and short stories. So it's a challenge, and it's different than what a novelist may be used to, but that's the fun of it.
And last but not least, Ryan.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Van Loan. I'm an epic fantasy author. My first trilogy is out with Tor Books. The debut last year was The Sin and the Steel. It's about an autodidact street rat and her partner in crime solving who take on a case that empires have failed to solve. Mayhem ensues with pirate queens and dead mages, and then the gods get involved. And the sequel, The Justice and Revenge, drops July 13th.
Very nice. So here's a question, just a broad question about the panel and what everyone would like to talk about, because my initial read of the description was an assumption that we were talking about creating characters for role-playing games. The description actually mentions the character builders and so on like that. But then I realized, oh, well, maybe it's just character creation for any kind of fiction, but it could be fiction specifically and not role-playing games at all. And that was just a red herring in the description. Does anyone have just thoughts about, like, do we want to focus on fiction writing, or do we want to talk about gaming as well? How does everyone feel about that?
So I can comment real quick. I am a gamer, but loosely. I mean, I play Resident Evil, frankly, and literally played this morning. So, but from that perspective, I think that character building is character building, and I think that it can tie into everything. And we don't have to necessarily omit role playing. I think that what we're talking about today will lead right into it. So.
Yeah, I agree. I saw that as RPG sheets being like one example of something you could use for character development, but I thought it was general, not the gaming.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, seems like consensus there. I think that there is actually a fair amount of overlap, but that's just fine. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the meat of it. Just let everybody know who's watching that if you want to join into the chat, you can make sure that you set the little 2 setting that's by where you type in, that you can set it to all panelists, and then all of us would see it, but not the rest of the attendees. So if you set that to all panelists and attendees, then everyone can see it. Also, though, if you have questions for us that you would like us to address directly, rather than chuckle at the funny joke you made in chat, what you should do is use the Q&A feature, and that's where you can put questions that we will be monitoring and can address more specifically. So, to begin, let's add the big question first. Uh, what comes first, character or story?
So I think that changes for every book or short story, to be honest with you. I think that sometimes you have a character in mind and you don't know where to place that character. Similar to when I remember when I first started writing years ago, I would write name lists, which I don't think I used any of them, but either way, I would write these lists of names that would be great in some story that I would come up with at some point. And you have that same mindset about characters, certain attributes you really want to, have a character embody. And that character came first in that scenario, but then you might have a story idea first and decide. I don't think there's like anything, and I think that ultimately, as we discussed today, what I'd love to make clear to people is that there's no wrong or right. There's no, hard and fast rule to anything. So if you come up with your character first, fantastic. If you come up with your story idea first, wonderful. If you have a setting that you love and that's what you're going to focus on and figure out all the rest, just because as long as it's set at this beach, great. That's just the way your mind works. And you'll do best if you just follow whatever your mind is telling you, whatever your, heart, soul, whatever you want to name it, label it, follow that because you know best about what you want to write. Gee, I summed that whole panel up. Okay, guys, I think I saved us 40 minutes.
Yeah, no, I think you answered it. We're good. That's or I could rule this panel with an iron fist and say, no, you must choose one.
You could do that.
Creative
but,
Thunderdome, yeah.
But Jay, what do you think? Like, what's your approach? Do you more generally conceive of a character first, or do you find a story has a hole that needs a specific type of shape to fill it?
I carry around with me a folder full of characters that have no story. I will know somebody, I'll meet somebody, or I'll come up with a concept for a character, and I'll just put them in a backpack. I'll put them in like a character sheet for an RPG, waiting for the right game to pull out and put them in. But on the other hand, there are stories that come first, and I have no idea how to create a unique character that would fit into that scenario. So I have placement labels for names. I have an antagonist. If I don't know who the antagonist is, I'll just call him Greg with 3 G's, just because I think that's kind of the name of a general antagonist. And then I will fill in the blanks later as I go through. So it's based on the story. If I have something that involves an epic fantasy or a large scale story, you're really not going to know how all these characters are going to move the plot around. But for an intimate story, what I might do is create a character and write a side story with those characters and just let them work out their issues and then try and apply those lessons to the main story.
Mm-hmm. Well, just a quick question as a follow up on that. The notebooks full of characters that don't have a story yet. How often do those characters ever actually make their way into a story, or is it just more of a creativity exercise?
I consider it like the island of misfit toys. I really don't think I'm ever going to find a place for all of them, but I have a private detective named Philip Horn who I've been desperately trying to get into anything from a Western to an epic fantasy tale. He just changes hats, but he never really fits. So
Mm.
it is a creative exercise. I mean, a lot of the fun of being a writer is the creation aspect. We sit down and, oh wow, I'm creating something out of nothing. It's so great. And that's the easy part of being a writer. Obviously, it's when you have to do the work to get them to integrate into a story. That's when it becomes writing. So I try to take the fun where I can, considering all of the work that's not as fun. So no, I will probably die with a bunch of characters in need of a story.
What about you, Anne?
Well, I agree with Elmarie and the others that, it varies from project to project. The piece I will add is that for me, like to address a lot of the other questions in the panel description about like, oh, do you need to know what their favorite color is ahead of time, or, that kind of thing. To me, what you should be starting with is in some ways the part that has come into your mind with this picture where you know it, like you really can picture it and feel. And as people have said, sometimes that's the setting. You could just absolutely picture this setting, and then you could just sort of go around and describe everything you see. And sometimes it's a person and you feel like, no, I totally, ask me any question about this person and I'll just know what this person. And so if you start with what with what you have the clearest imagination of, then it's easier to fill in the blanks, I think.
How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, so I'm interested in that I plot very heavily. So I have a 7-point plot structure that I go through. I write up a synopsis, and I do, all of that is kind of like my first and almost second draft before I write any prose. But that said, I kind of do pants my characters because I don't set out to write anything until a character comes to mind, and it's really the story coalesces around them. So almost every story I've ever written has been that a character voice just came into my head and started talking to me. And it's normally when I'm like going for a walk or I'm in the shower or, I'm out on a hike and this voice just speaks to me. And you can only get away with that if you're a writer, I think, having voices just appear in your head. But yeah, I mean, that's how it always starts. And normally it's a sentence, and then that sentence comes with some feelings and a sense of who they are, and that will tell me what type of story this is going to be. I'll get a feel for what what era I'm going to put this in, because I write fantasy. So is it going to be like Renaissance or pre-industrial or post-industrial, or are we going back to medieval times? What's it look like? And so all of that is kind of a slow process over a couple of weeks, where I'm just kind of letting them sit in the back of my mind and tell me who they are. And then somewhere along there, they're going to let me know what they want, what their motivation is. And then at that point, that's where I go to my plot structure, start at the ending, kind of figure out what that ending is going to be, which is always difficult, and work my way through that. And then all of that happens before I start to actually write. But by the time I'm writing, I've kind of already told myself their story 2 or 3 times. So then it's just making sure that I can capture it down.
Nice. So one of the things that I think is interesting to just reflect on the idea of uh, gaming character creation versus fiction is that there's a lot of similarity. I think a lot of game players will just make endless characters for role-playing games, whether they're going to play them in a game or not. But I think one of the things that tends to make a more successful campaign is when you have the entire party making characters together and informing each other, and having connections between each other to begin with. So, to apply that to fiction, the idea of creating a character in isolation versus how do you take a character created in isolation and make them fit in the setting? How does their character get informed by the setting and story being told? Uh, Anne?
Yeah, I think I think in real life, we are largely defined by relationships. And that's also true in fiction, right? And so sometimes you're starting with, well, she's the mother. And there are a lot of books where it's like, well, there's just this mother. And that's kind of her only character trait. And obviously we want to make people well-rounded. So you don't want that to be the only character trait. But at the same time, that is a really important part of who someone is and what decisions they'll make and what reaction they'll have. And so I think you're absolutely right, Christiana, that any given character is kind of meaningless unless you know who they're related to. And that includes their relation with place or their relation with what has just happened to them, and how, based on who they are, they're going to react. One person will react very differently from another to the same situation. So I love that idea of, even though we often, I think a lot of us often start with, oh, here's this person and they would be like this and they would be like that. But I think there's a limit to how far you get until you start spreading out into their networks, into their webs.
What about you, Jay?
I get a little nerdy about it. I think of a character, I ask, what is the purpose of this character in this story, and then what do they want, as it may be not the same thing. And I will create the once I establish the purpose and the value of the character in the story, all and have all of them together, I'll create an Excel spreadsheet and put the names of the character on the rows and then in the columns, and then go through each cell and say, what is this character's relationship with this character? They hate, love, apathetic, don't know them. And then I work through that matrix, and that starts me to think about how clusters of characters would gravitate toward one another and how others would repel one another. And that kind of informs the story, because I'm more of a pantser than a plotter. And if I have an idea for the thread through the story, and I have a vague notion of what a supporting character will do, I can find maybe a way to navigate one character to interact with a subplot by just focusing on how one character may feel or does feel about another character. And that's just kind of a thought exercise where you don't have to write a lot of prose, but you're looking at a label for a character, you know their purpose and their goal, who's counter to that goal, and what obstacles all the characters are going to face in that journey through that story. So that's one way that I work it out.
Interesting. Ryan?
Yeah, so again, it kind of comes back to that character voice in my head, but I'll give you an example. So my current trilogy, I mentioned pirates and stuff like that, and that came from, the character like kind of letting me know who they were. They grew up on the streets. They're a private investigator. Got a Mediterranean Caribbean world feel from their voice and their world that they were living in. So then I started to kind of build that world out based upon that. And then, if we're thinking about private investigators and, pirates and the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, start to think about age of sail, age of mercantilism. So that means trading companies and things like that. And so, one of the most powerful trading companies in the world is trying to blackmail her. And that's what kind of is the inciting incident. And so all of that just starts to build on one another. And I will make connections to, the quote unquote real world, as far as like, where am I going to set this from a technology perspective, or what are the different relationships within the world from a power structure, what's that going to look like. So that helps to kind of inform the setting and what I'm putting together there. And then, what I really like to do at that point is just kind of let everything develop naturally from there through the plot. So, the character arc, I don't necessarily have fully formed in my head what that's going to look like when I'm writing, but I know what the character has to do to get from point A to point B. And so for me, the fun part is watching that character develop with the relationships on the page with other characters, and seeing that all come together. And that to me is the surprising part. So even though, plot wise, it's, a lot of outlining on the character side, it really is that organic experience. And then just letting that continue to build until you have, a big enough iceberg that you can kind of set sail and float off.
Elmarie?
I think that as I listen to all these answers, I'm realizing how much of a pantser I truly am. I am not making spreadsheets. I don't plot at all. I literally sit down and say, okay, let's go. And I figure out where it takes me. And for me, that is the joy of writing. I love every minute of what I'm doing. So like, again, I should have a slogan behind me that says there's no right way. But when I think about my characters, I am a huge subscriber to the idea that all of our characters have a piece of us in them. And so my characters react to different scenarios. Some react the way I would react verbatim. Others react the complete opposite to what I would, and it's this, like Ryan mentioned, it's a voice in your head. And I do agree with you that only writers can get away with that. Just that's because when I say it aloud to people who are not writers, I realize I probably should not have. And so I understand, but it's very much this sort of feeling that we have about, the work that we're putting together, whatever that story is, how bare bones it is or not. And those characters fall in this, I don't want to say they fall in line, but they sort of, because a lot of times my characters dictate where we're going. But at the same time, it's my thought and my reaction and my interaction with the world. So like Anne mentioned, that we're part of, we're defined by relationships and those decisions that we would make as part of those relationships. So the mother idea, this person's going to make certain decisions related to the children, but also related to her life, because that's going to relate to the children, because everything comes back to that core. But if I write psychological horror, so my decisions might be very different. My mother character might be completely different than what might have happened in sci-fi and fantasy. And that's, at the same time, it's the beauty of the differences of genre, but it's the beauty of the differences of us as individual humans, because we're coming to it from a different position, even if we are mothers or fathers or brothers or sisters, having that commonality, but that doesn't mean the same thing. It doesn't, you know, each family makeup is different. Mother might mean something entirely different from a horror perspective, you know, than it would in a drama. So I think when I'm talking about character development, when I'm thinking, because it very much, Jay mentioned something that kind of, with that spreadsheet you put together, really spoke to me of like the character arcs that we used to put. You have the whole detail, like you mentioned, what's the favorite color, what's their favorite movie, what do they like to eat. But I don't care. Like I'll come up with it when I'm going, if I need it, because I'm never gonna write that unless I need it, right? And at that time, I can decide if her favorite color is green. It's not, I didn't need that to determine who she was, because she in part is me, if that makes any sense. So
Yeah. I think one of the things that really makes characters feel three-dimensional and compelling is the way that they do seem to be informed by and reactive to the rest of the world around them in the story. And so certainly genre plays into that quite a bit. You know, the mother who is just hoping that their son doesn't choose to be an asteroid miner, which will take them far away, and versus the mother who is just afraid that the werewolves are going to break into her house that night. You know, like those are different characters.
right.
But one of the things that's a question in our title description is the idea of getting into things like your character's favorite color, their favorite shoe size. Certainly, in order for a character to feel alive on the page, you need to have some level of telling details about them that make them not just a cipher, a blank space in the shape of a person in the story, right? You need some level of detail, but how much is too much? Ryan, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think everything on the page should be serving multiple purposes. So if your character's favorite color is going to serve multiple purposes in a scene, then by all means go ahead and do that. But and if it makes you happy, I mean, pursue happiness. But I think for me, it's more about form and function and how those fit together. If a character really loves reading, so that's cool. That's something the reader probably should be able to relate to if they're reading the book. But it needs to do more than that. So, are they referencing books that then impact the scene? Are they using knowledge from books to get themselves out of a sticky situation? Do they have arguments about books? Maybe they're reading something that's considered, heretical in their society, and so there's a danger there. But ultimately, at least two, if not three or more purposes, I think something about that character has to serve. So yeah, I mean, for me, that's what it is. It's what's the baseline I need to know to feel comfortable in this character's skin to write them, and then what am I putting on the page, and is it serving multiple purposes? And maybe it's not in that first draft, but definitely on the revision, I want to make sure that it is, so that it's not. I think you need to be careful as a writer sometimes, and every writer is different. But if you know this about yourself, like if you're one of those types that loves all those details, like you're not putting stuff in there that's just for you, that's cool if you want to write a story just for you. But if you're looking to sell it, and I think you do need to edit yourself back sometimes and just make sure that what you're doing there is going to resonate with the reader.
Anne?
Yeah, so as Jay's saying, there's two issues here. One is what you know, and the other is what you write. And it's the iceberg concept, right? You are probably going to know a ton more about your characters than will actually show up on the page. So how much is too much? Well, I guess there is a danger that if you are using character creation as like a procrastination from like just getting to this, like, enough, just start writing, and that is potentially a danger. But barring that, as much as makes you happy, right? But then just because you know what their favorite color is doesn't mean the reader needs to end up finding that out. Or maybe maybe they're wearing a red sweatshirt because you know that's their favorite color. Reader doesn't need to know that's why it's a red sweatshirt. I mean, and this the purpose that it serves in the story may be making them stand out in the crowd so that somebody spots them, or that was the cat, or or whatever purpose it serves, right? So just remember sort of that there are always two levels to this character. There's the whole infinity of what any character is, and there's what actually shows up in the story.
Jay?
Part of it is the significance of the character in the story. Readers love to get into the details with protagonists, particularly you're going to have somebody who's going to be carrying 3 or 4 books. You're going to want to know what they have for breakfast, what their preferences are, all those little idiosyncrasies of a main character that they carry that supporting characters don't. One of the things I think about is the type of writer and the type of story being told. Say, for example, if I'm watching an Aaron Sorkin series or film, I know that the characters are part of a chorus. They're all singing the same song and contributing to that same story, but we're never going to know, what they had for breakfast. We're never really going to get into their personal lives because their individual lives are insignificant compared to what's going on at the White House or at the news studio. And that's a style of writing. The writer tries to focus you on the story itself at the expense of individual characters. But the other extreme, I think, would be if I'm writing for Law and Order. There's always some kind of Easter egg around the characters, little details because of the genre in part, because it's a mystery or intrigue, where you have to lay those eggs around the crime scene, and you have to put in little details about every single character, down to the point where, if you notice in an episode of any Law and Order episode, they go talk to witnesses, and they're just not throwaway dumb characters. They all have one or two weird traits that make them interesting. And you don't need to get into their family history, but there's one thing about them that makes them interesting to the reader or the viewer, that is just picked out, whether it's the neighborhood they're in, the job that they perform, or just their character, the snarkiness or the just the attitude of the character that defines and allows the reader or viewer to fill in all those blanks. So I think in my case, I'm writing screenplays. If I'm writing an audio play or a stage play, I also have to know that I need to leave room for the actor to inhabit that role and create some of those things on their own. So depending on the medium you're working in, you have to structure your story so you're either directing like an auteur to say to the actor what to do and not deviate, or you give them the creative freedom to create those little bits and pieces and details and collaborate with you as a writer to enhance that character and the relationship to the rest of the cast.
Marie?
I think that you have to decide what's important, what moves the story forward. If I'm a fan of the style of everything of the scene is the important scene. This is this moment in time, and so everyone converges on that one moment, and everyone's dealing with that, so that their personal lives are not necessarily ones that we know about. Except this, if we're all standing in a boardroom and then someone gets a personal call and it's their child on the phone, now we have a little bit of the detail of their lives, and if they have to panic and run out of the room because something's going on at home, we may not know what all of the details are, but now we have a little bit of texture. And I think if you can add some text, if the characters' details add texture to the story, then there's such a thing as too much. I mean, sure, you can't be heavy-handed, right? I mean, you don't want to pull away from the main story because you're so focused on the details of one character. I mean, that's just not, if it's not adding, it's not important. But if it's adding that texture, then I don't see a reason to not. Sure, we don't need to know about all the supporting characters' details. We don't. I mean, because then who's the important character here? Who should we be focusing on, right? Again, like I said, it's all about moving the story forward. And if you can do that and add some texture at the same time, then I think that you're hitting that right balance.
Nice. One of the things that I sometimes reflect on when it comes to this question is there's a bit in A Wise Man's Fear. Patrick Rothfuss, where he's talking about maps in particular, and the idea that like on a map you'll have just an area that's circled and it says this is the forest, and you know that there's the forest there, but that's just a line. What's in the forest? You have no idea. But having a picture of it, the little circle that says this is the forest, makes you think you know what's there. And so the idea of sketching in character details, but starting at that high level of like, oh, this person is a picky eater. Why? You don't have to get into why necessarily until it's important. But we actually have a question from the Q&A. David Griffith asks, do your techniques to develop your protagonists differ from those you use for your antagonists? Is an antagonist just a protagonist who, to use K.M. Whalen's terminology, rejected the truth and ran back to the lie at the key moment in their life?
I can.
Go ahead.
I think that you've got to, I mean, the detail that you're putting into your protagonist should absolutely be used for your antagonist, or else that person, that character is just a prop. I mean, and you want the, again, texture, detail, color. You need that character to be, of course, I'm a horror author, so I live in the antagonist world, right? But you want that detail. You want that well-roundedness, or else you're not going to really be afraid of whatever it is that I've tried to make you afraid of. You're not going to feel that sense of dread, that fear, because I don't deal, my subgenre doesn't deal totally in blood. So I've got to try and frighten you so that when you are in the dark and in the shadows, you are actually still thinking about the story you read in the broad daylight. So I can't do that if my antagonist isn't well-rounded. So you absolutely should put that time in. So all of this character development should apply to your antagonist as well.
Anne?
In some ways, I am the opposite of Elle Marie, but I arrive at the same place. So that is to say that in a lot of my books, the antagonist is not at all a horrible person. You know, there are definitely some bad guys who are bad because they made bad choices and they're trying to do bad things. But there's also a lot of cases where it's just people with opposing goals, and they're both potentially well-meaning, and they're both potentially, motivated, just like a lot of people, a lot of us are. And so, but that arrives at the same spot, which is to say, you need to have, it needs to make sense that they're doing what they're trying to do. It can't be arbitrary. It can't be, well, I woke up this morning, decided I would be evil. That said, I think it goes back to what Jay was saying a little bit about how focused are we on the character. And, there are some antagonists where they are absolutely an equal and opposite focus, but there are other stories where the antagonist is a little more off stage or a little more, and I think you don't need quite as much detail and quite as much depth on them. So, it does vary.
Okay.
That's a good point. And I think when I write a zombie story, a lot of people make the mistake of saying that the zombies are the antagonists, when it's really people with opposite intents or goals that they just can't work together. And so the characters of the zombie as a monster actually become more of a force of nature. And they're the ones that are the catalyst to the true story of people who are just trying to get along and survive. And those are real people who are, by nature, they may all be good because all they want is to protect what's theirs. So it's important for the reader or the listener or the viewer to empathize at least with the goals of the antagonist and the protagonist, because it's not necessarily good and evil. There's a lot of gray when it turns into survival. A lot of what I put into HG World many years ago was based on people being forced into a stadium during Hurricane Katrina. And I'd challenge someone to find a truly evil that's stuck inside of a stadium during a natural disaster who didn't do evil things during that time. So in order to sell that, those people have to have some motivation that compromises their general goodness and that allows the character, the readers to empathize and keeps the drama and the conflict more interesting. Um, when I cross purposes, the book that I wrote for my master's thesis, Resurrection Pact, involved a hero's journey where the protagonist had no power, no knowledge of the world he was entering. He really didn't have any interest in getting into it. The antagonist was so far above him in terms of status and power that it was almost a natural adversary as opposed to a human adversary. It's someone who owns a corporation and has hundreds of people working at his disposal. Who's the true antagonist? Is it the minion? Is it the first big boss, or is it really the person who's pulling the strings? And that determines how much detail you put into the antagonist, because you want to keep an air of mystery about the guy in the penthouse office who's pulling all the strings. So who's going to be the person that the protagonist mainly interacts with and has the biggest issues with? That's the person you put the most detail in, because that's the most time you're going to be spending. So it really depends on the scope of your story.
Mhm.
From, I think, an intimate horror story where you're battling your demons literally, to an epic fantasy where one warrior is never going to see the king of the opposing kingdom.
How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, the type of antagonists that you're going for. Are they just like an inscrutable malice like a Sauron? Are they, a character just like your protagonist? Are they a system? And so depending on what that is, or an organization, you're going to have to do it in different ways and think about it in different ways. We might not really need to know what Sauron's true motivation is. We just need to know that,
Or his favorite color.
or his favorite color.
Shoe size?
Exactly. We just need to know that he wants to rule the world and he's a bad dude, and we don't need much more than that. But that's because the story we're trying to tell isn't this personal story about overcoming Sauron. It's about kind of overcoming this force of nature. Whereas, like, for me, what I really like to write are stories about, protagonists trying to take on systems of power, structures of power, organizations. And the fun bit about that is that, they might run into various flavors of those antagonists, when they run into the minions that are supporting and upholding these structures. And some of those folks might just be there because they needed a job. Some of those folks might be true believers. Others might just be opportunists, but it gives you different flavors. And so, to the extent that that antagonist is in that scene, you need to give them some detail. And what I like to do is just make sure that each one of those is expressing a slightly different viewpoint that, woven together kind of gives you a sense of why this organization exists, why it's been able to get to where it's at, and, why our protagonist would oppose it. So, I mean, it's a great question. I think there's a million ways to do it, as I think everybody here had a slightly different take on it. But yeah.
Well, so it's funny that you mentioned Sauron. First of all, we have Calvin Beam in the chat saying, "Poor Sauron. No one ever thinks about his feelings." Um, but the reason that I think it's interesting to mention Sauron is that, to be sure, as depicted in the main trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, like, Sauron is this just inscrutable menace. He wants evil, bad stuff to happen. We got to stop him, and that's really almost all you really need to know about him. Except that, like, he made these rings, and at least one of them is evil. The others are, it's a little unclear. But the truth is, though, that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote tons of
Mhm.
lore about what Sauron's whole deal was. And in fact, my understanding is that this new TV show that they're making is going to tell some of that story of who was Sauron before he was the big flaming lidless eyeball in a tower and all of that sort of thing. So it just comes back to this idea of, like, how much of that lore was on the page of Tolkien's sketchbook before he started writing Lord of the Rings. I'm not actually a Tolkien scholar, so I don't know the timeline of that exactly. But it does just come back to this idea of, like, do you create characters in a vacuum and then put them in? And for that matter, it shows how much you can have tons of detail written in, and
Mhm.
that, And not all of that needs to be in the main story.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I know, like, so the footnotes in The Return of the King at the end there, I think he does get into a little bit of Sauron's background, although not as much as like the Silmarillion and the Book of Unfinished Tales. But I'm curious because then, like, basically, I'm just interested. I'd be very interested. Obviously, we can't talk to him. I'd be very interested to know, how he arrived at that and why he made the choices he did. Because, did he need to know all of Sauron's background to write the trilogy, or did he like kind of push that to the side and say like, okay, that's how this guy got here, but none of that really matters for the story. All you need to know is that he's this flaming eye and like he's gonna destroy the world if you don't stop him. It's really intriguing, and it is kind of one of those questions of what comes first, what detail do you need to include, and at the end of the day, what matters versus it doesn't. Sauron, the stories of him in those other books, it's much more important that we understand a little bit about his motivation or why he's doing what he's doing. And yet for the trilogy, we don't really get a whole sense of what he's doing, except that he just wants world domination. So yeah, that's a really interesting thought.
Yeah. Keith Soares in the chat says, I want to believe that Sauron can buy any size shoes and they will resize to fit his feet, just like the One Ring, which is obviously the right answer. Now, it's interesting because we could take another very popular entertainment franchise that takes almost the opposite approach, which is, say, Star Wars, where Star Wars just throws a million things at the screen and all of the lore tends to get filled in after the fact. It's like, who was that guy that had the death sentence on 12 systems in Mos Eisley Cantina? Well, we got to have someone write a short story about him afterwards and explain what he did, and he went from this system and it was like that before. Anne, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up, because that actually, I don't like that. I don't like that they fill in the story on a lot of those things, because we're talking here about, knowing everything and having all the answers. But like when you walk into a cantina, you don't know the backstory of every single person who's in there. That's not how the world works. That's not how we experience the world and other people. And one of the things I really loved about the original Star Wars trilogy, and when I saw it, is this idea that there's this whole world out there. And I don't know, and I don't need to know. I just know that all those people are going about their business. And that to me was like, I was a kid at the time and I was like, wow. And then you go back in and you're like, well, his name is really George Smith and he's mad because his parents were killed by droids. And I'm like, no, I don't want to hear that. Just let him be. Let him just live his own life. I don't need to know.
I'm seeing nods from El Marie.
Yeah, I agree with Anne wholeheartedly. And I was actually going to bring it up. So it's like perfect that we're here. It's the same idea. Here's the room. Something's happening in this room. 20 people are in the room. I don't need to know everything that happens in those 20 people's lives after they leave the room or prior to them getting to that room. There's this whole, I don't care about Boba Fett, because I'm like, so what? And a lot of people do, right? A lot of people do. And I'm like, I don't get it. Like, what's the, I thought it was intriguing when we started talking about, Darth Vader, who's my favorite character, of course. But, when we started getting into the whole Anakin, when he was a child and all this, I kind of said, you have to pay attention, Lisa. You have to enjoy this. But I didn't actually want to see all of that. I prefer him as the evil now. He's the baddie, and I know it. And I like that character from that point. The child, it changed my perspective on the character, to be honest with you. It changed a lot of things, and not necessarily in a good way. So I think that's some of the challenge and some of the danger when you sort of, put too much in, or you think too long and hard about what this character is doing and why. They are afraid of anything sharp because they stepped on a staple when they were 4. We don't need to know that. Or they really like sharp things because they stepped on a staple. You know what I mean? We don't need to know why they wield this knife now. We just know they wield the knife. And because then wielding the knife now is what's important today. So I don't know that we need to go back into those backstories so much. A little bit's fine, but too much is too much, I think. And when we go down to the point where the character changes and the emotion that you have towards that character is now no longer, if it's a sinister one, we don't feel that sinister thing anymore. We feel, oh, but they were damaged as a child by what, if we start to feel that sensitivity, that really changes your perspective on the character, the role in the movie, whatever it is, as you move forward. And then the story's different now. So
So I like the phrase that you used in the chat there, Ryan. Do you want to share that in the?
Oh yeah, no, just Elmarie, when you were talking, I was thinking that you're right. It's a risk to expose that iceberg, because you risk changing everything. So if you're going to do it, I think you need to have a really good reason, and you have to execute it really well, and just be conscious of that. And I think sometimes, and I don't think it's like, I want to be careful here. Like, it's not like Star Wars' fault because it's a franchise. I think it's just a product of the fact that they brought in so many different creators and they do it piecemeal. And so you don't have one person that's just sitting there thinking very carefully about, Darth Vader was scary and terrible for many different reasons, and his fall from grace was this big mystery. And so if you're going to reveal that mystery, it better be even cooler than, just knowing that there was a mystery. So yeah, I think that's definitely something for creators to be wary of.
See, we got half the panelists talking in the chat too. I'm monitoring both. But you ask for more Darth Maul. I mean, this is a perfect example of like you got to look at the the Clone Wars TV show actually has more Darth Maul.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. I will do that.
Yeah,
I need more Darth Maul. I love that
because
guy.
he absolutely does survive, and he has cool robot spider legs for a while.
Ooh.
Yeah.
But listen, they introduced this fantastic character, make him so incredibly cool. Like
Mhm.
some of us really gravitate to that character.
Yeah.
And he's gone.
Well,
Like, what?
sorry, Jay, you were trying to say something?
It's okay. I getting back to Tolkien, I think Tolkien did a lot of what he did for his own sake. I mean, he invented languages specifically for the trilogy,
Mhm.
and he was passionate about that stuff. George Lucas did the same thing for the original trilogy, but he did it to sell toys. So he knew that he could fill the back of an action figure blister pack with a history of a character. And what he created was adopted by fans. And I think one of the great things about writing great fiction is that the fans are going to take your intellectual property, they're going to take the characters from your story, and they're going to give them a life all of their own, independent of whether or not I think it's accurate or not. And I think that's the greatest tribute to a creator, that or Wikipedia will be created based on your franchise, and they will go down and they will create all of those details about your characters. And with Star Wars, it's a commercial no-brainer that anything that doesn't make it to the page will end up somewhere else, and that way the fans will say, that's cool, I want to see more of that character. In fact, the last 3 movies in Star Wars were a marketing attempt to say, that faceless woman who was with Poe for like 10 minutes and did nothing, do you want to see a miniseries about her? Tell us on the Wikipedia page and all that stuff. I mean, that's more commercial, but one of the things that I experienced was I created a character for my audio drama series that I thought was just a throwaway character. And he was just this dorky Golem ripoff that I had to just be as an obstacle for the characters to get from one place to another. But the people who listened to the show liked that character so much and the actor's performance of it that I made him a whole story arc. So, when the story transcends what you intend, I have no problem with that at all. Pour it all onto the Wikipedia, and if somebody wants to option that, I'm not going to complain about it.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of that just comes down to you can't always know what's going to be a hit with the audience, right? But I think that it also comes down to I think you really hit the nail on the head, Ryan, when you talked about execution being so important, because I think the Star Wars prequel trilogy is a perfect illustration of this. That I think at a high level, the story, the plot of the prequel trilogy is not bad. It just fails on the execution level. And I think that the risk that you take when choosing to tell a story that's going to impact existing material, like a prequel will, you have to nail the execution or else it affects everything. But then, we're just talking about Star Wars now. I will just remind everyone that we're coming close to the end of the panel. So if you have any last minute questions you want to throw into the Q&A, now would be the time, because
we should have had a Star Wars panel because we could talk about this. We could
Oh, wow.
view the Darth Maul short film. I never heard about this. I'm going to be looking at that.
Yeah,
after
I don't
this.
know that one either. But like the new Bad Batch cartoon is good. Anyway, Yes, I think we could all probably talk about Star Wars, but I think in general, um, it seems like we've maybe kind of come around to a little bit of a consensus, which is that, building characters in isolation can be, fun and a creative exercise in general, but like, how often are those characters going to find their way into an actual story as opposed to having a world for a character to occupy and then developing them at that point. Oh, we have a question from Amy Herring. Do any of you have a favorite character reference sheet that you can recommend and provide a link to? Hmm. Uh, I'm thinking about like, are we talking about like role playing game type character sheets that you could create for a character? Is that that might be the gist there? I'm not sure that everyone here has a lot of. I don't know how much gaming experience you all have.
Entire back wall there.
Yeah.
I use Call of Cthulhu for horror stories. I use Dungeons and Dragons for obviously for fantasy stories. I don't do that very often. But I will say that if you want a an OCD level character development system that will help you, it would be the Palladium Fantasy or their pan universal system. They have everything from superheroes to secret agents to fantasy, and it gets so into the weeds that it will be asking you questions like, where did this character last eat? Where did the what color are this character's eyes, and what's the socioeconomic background of this character? Palladium is by far the most detailed character generation system I've ever seen, to the point it's overwhelming. But it has helped me create a lot of great characters in different genres.
Anyone else have examples?
No, I don't use character sheets, so I'm not a good resource, unfortunately.
Well, there is actually, if anyone's just interested in like character creation sort of exercises and prompts, there is a book by James D'Amato of the One Shot Podcast Network called The Ultimate RPG Character Backstory Guide. And it's really a lot of just, sort of games and thought exercises to help you sort of figure out some of these telling details about your character, that I can recommend that book. But since we're close enough to the end here, how about everybody maybe just briefly go over what else you've got coming up this weekend or anything else you'd like to plug? Anne, would you like to start?
So I got all kinds of stuff. I would like to plug, I'm giving a lecture presentation, whatever one person thing, this afternoon about medieval bestiaries and the fantastical beasts therein and how that inspired my most recent book, which isn't really at all a character book because it's a bestiary. And then I'm also doing readings from a couple of books, of kids' books. I have a reading this afternoon for little kids and a reading on Sunday from the Book of Extraordinary Doors, which is a middle grade fantasy novel. So yeah, I'd be happy to have anyone come join me.
Marie?
Sure. I wanted to make a quick comment about the character sheets. I don't use them, so I couldn't comment there. But what I do want to suggest is that character sheets are one thing, going out in the wild is another. Go out and people watch. And that doesn't mean stalk anybody, right? But just go out, go to a park, because now things are opening up. Look around, see what people do. Some of that backstory you'll fill in. If the kids can't play soccer, but the dad is trying to help, you can make the rest of that stuff up. And that's the fun of it. So, but you might not have thought to add that character in, and now you've got one or two new characters that you can use. So,
I think that's an excellent point, but we're like at like a 1 minute warning, so let's.
Okay, and I'll do it quick.
Yeah,
okay.
We can go into Discord after.
I'm Elmarie Wood. You can come see me at elmariewood.com. Today, in fact, I have a panel at 7, writing psychological horror, which is like awesome, and I have a reading at 9. So I'll see you later.
Jay?
Real quick, if you want to download any of my free audio drama content, it's at jsmithaudio.com. I have a panel at 11:30 today about generational changes in fandom, which means we're going to be talking a lot about Star Wars. So if you want to join us there and continue this conversation, I'll be there with Gilsey, Martin, and others.
Great. Ryan?
Yeah, so I have two panels tomorrow at 2:30 and 8:30. 8:30 is writing characters with agency. So if you're interested in more character stuff, stop by for that. Again, my debut, The Sin and the Steel, is available now, and the sequel drops in July, The Justice and Revenge. You can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Van Loan. Happy to chat, and I'll be in the Discord after.
Great. And I am Christiana Ellis. I have a couple of more panels today that are on the gaming track, which is why I think I had that on the mind. But at 1 p.m., I have Love the Setting, Hate the System, which is about mixing and matching mechanics versus lore in different games. And then also at 4 p.m., good first-time RPGs that aren't D&D. But also you can find all of my fiction, vlog videos, and gaming content at christianaellis.com. So I also will be in the St. George Discord room after that if anyone wants to continue the discussion. But in the meantime, I think we're at time. So thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the panel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for
everybody.
the Darth Maul stuff. You guys, that was fun.
Yay.